Hi, I'm Ariel. You're watching She Wants the Diction, and today I'm going to be reviewing the Racial Healing Handbook by Anneliese Singh. And the first thing I want to kind of talk about is how I ended up reading this, basically. So as I've said before, last year I read a lot of nonfiction text by Black authors about racism and race issues, and I also read pretty much all of the popular anti-racist books. So I'm talking How to Be an Anti-Racist, I'm talking So You Want to Talk About Race, White Fragility, like literally almost every single one that was popular during like June and beyond, I read. When this year rolled around, I kind of realized that I was sick of texts that were written towards a white audience about racism, like explaining racism, just because I read so many of them last year. While for a while that was really, it was fun and it was interesting and it was informative and all that stuff, like I find it interesting to compare and contrast like different people's views on racism and like the different terminologies and theories and all these different things. I found it fun at first, but eventually I just started feeling like I want something that's written for me. Like, I am biracial, so Black dad, white mom, mixed, multiracial, whatever you want to call it. Like, I am both. And so I really wanted something that was talking to me. Like, I wanted something that was sort of for us, by us. I wanted something by a Black author that was speaking to, not explaining racism to white folks, but talking about our healing and ways that we can heal from all of the damage that racism has done. And I find this doubly important as somebody who, because of financial constraints and also just like not trusting the medical system, doesn't have access to therapy, basically. And also it would probably be really difficult to find a therapist that could address something like racial trauma. And so I sort of started a search or a hunt for books that were specifically addressing Black healing, preferably by a non-white author. And so in my search, this workbook was one of the many books that I came across. I started this a couple weeks ago. Obviously, since it's a library book, I couldn't write directly in it. So instead, I just have like my journal that I use. Like I would just read the prompts and then basically journal in here. And right off the bat, starting this book, I felt some type of way because the introduction is by Tim Wise, who is a white guy. And basically in there he says some shit like, until Black people can feel safe calling the cops on a white supremacist, the cops are just going to be a function of white supremacy. And that immediately like clued me in that this book was not going to be radical enough for me. And this is the same problem I had with So You Want to Talk About Race, and it's sort of this liberal reformist idea that like we could somehow fix policing when, you know, it's based off of slave patrols. Like, it has always been an institution that's upheld white supremacy, and, you know, hiring Black cops or making sure that Black people feel equally protected by the police is not a solution for me, in other words. I don't think that's radical enough. I don't think we're imagining enough. And so that really put me off to begin with. And then I started the book, and immediately one of my thoughts was, you know, this isn't for me. Like, I specifically came to this book, and I mean, it's in the title, Healing, looking for something that would help me heal from racism. And what I found was something that was equally talking to people of color and white people. And what really bothered me about this is that I don't think white people and people of color are equally harmed by racism. I just don't. I do understand that racism harms everyone. Like, it is a very harmful concept. It manifests in all of these very nasty ways. But I don't think that white people experience racism the same as we do. I do understand that white people internalize a sense of superiority, and that when they begin to realize their privilege and their complicity in white supremacy, you know, they may experience intense feelings of guilt, anger, maybe even shame. Like, all of these emotions may come up in them, but I don't think it's anything compared to experiencing racism directly. You're not benefiting from it. You're not the perpetrator of it. You're not complicit with it. Like, to be a person of color, you are experiencing racism in a much more different and, I think, a stronger way than white people are experiencing it. Like, they are not hurt by it to the same extent that people of color are. And I'm not saying this is some type of oppression Olympics, who can be the most hurt, who can be the most oppressed, who can be the most whatever. All I'm saying is I think it is two totally different things. And this book really tried to lump both of them together. It was like racism harms both. I don't disagree with that. I just don't think it harms both to the same extent. And so what really bothered me is I came here for my healing, and we are once again addressing white people. Like, this is exactly what I came to this book to get away from, because I thought that it would be speaking to me. Like, sometimes I just wish that people of color could have something that was just for us. And a lot of times white people will take offense at that because they see that as you not including them, when it's like, you are included in everything else. You have a hand in everything. You could go anywhere and do anything. The whole point of having a space for people of color is because we don't have those spaces anywhere else, you know what I mean? And so I really, really didn't like that. But despite me not liking that, I decided to stick with the book, try to read and respond to all of the prompts, and just see how I felt. And I realized a couple chapters into it that a lot of the prompts were very repetitive in nature. And so I stopped writing something for every single prompt and just kind of like thought about it. So for the first couple of chapters, Know Your Racial Identity and Explore Internalized Racism, I did do all of the prompts for those chapters. Then I got to a chapter called Relearn the History of Racism. And I really, the re is in parentheses, so I guess it could be learn the history of racism if you've never learned it, relearn it if you already know something about it. But the reason that I had to roll my eyes is because, like, I spent the past year learning about racism, and I feel like it's one of my coping mechanisms to just learn as much information as I possibly can about, like, racism and racial dynamics. And I feel like, in some strange way, I know this is not true, but in some strange way, I feel like having that information in my head, knowing as much as I can about it, somehow protects me. Like, I feel safer knowing everything that I possibly can. I feel safer to have terminology to use to describe it, or theories that I can use to describe it. Like, even though I know it doesn't really protect me, it makes me feel safer in my own mind to understand all the aspects about it. And so, when I got to relearn the history of racism, I was just like, I know this, you know, like, I know all this. I think it's just preposterous to assume that reading this as a black person, you will not have already studied somewhat about race and about racism, because this is something that impacts your everyday life. Like, this is something that is really, really personally important to me. And so I was just like, it just felt like it wasn't for me. I was like, this is not for me. My understanding of racism goes so far beyond the basic summary that was in here that, like, this is not helpful to me. And I understand maybe this was a book that was written for a beginner, or for a white person, because most white people see themselves as default and don't have to think about race very much, and therefore don't know very much about it. And so I could definitely see this as being a good book for, like, a beginner or a white person that's just beginning their racial education, which for a lot of people only started last June. But black people, people of color, have been living with this shit our entire lives, and so this just feels like so simplistic and so unhelpful. Like, it's so surface level. So despite knowing that my own personal investigations took me way beyond the summary that was this chapter, I continued in the book. The other chapters are Understand Racism and Relationships, Raise Your Race Consciousness, Catch Yourself in the Flow of Racism, Grieve and Name Racism, Learn to be an Ally, and Reclaim Your Whole Self. Now, I don't want to make it sound like this book was all negative, because I think it did make me aware of a couple things. Not anything that's really life-changing or that I feel like particularly helped me heal, but it did introduce me to a couple things that I hadn't previously been aware of. One of them was this chart of racial identity development, and you can see it's got people of color on top and then, like, white people on the bottom, and they kind of follow the same steps, but they're slightly different. And this is not like a step-by-step thing. They were talking about how you can kind of fluctuate between all these different steps. It's not necessarily like a linear progression, and that, like, you will fluctuate throughout them, probably, you know, throughout your life. You'll be at different stages. So we've got conformity, dissonance, immersion, emersion, and then we've got internalization and integrative awareness. So I feel like lately, especially with a lot of the, like, microaggressions and stuff that I've been experiencing, comments on my channel and social media, etc., I have been experiencing dissonance, which is, as a person of color, you experience one or more critical incidents of racism and realize the world isn't fair or equitable when it comes to race. Did that really happen? Was that directed towards me? Wait, I am a good person. Why would they treat me that way? The experience is not only shocking, unexpected, and unfair, but it also seeds your suspicions of the motivations of white people. As a person of color, you begin to see the world differently in terms of race. Feelings include confusion, surprise, and anger. And then immersion is the schema where you notice more and more of the racial inequities you and other people of color experience and feel anger towards white people. You don't feel as safe being around white people because you can't trust them. You assume that all white people are racist. Feelings include disillusionment, frustration, anger, and worry. And then immersion is the schema where you become engrossed in your own racial community due to the distrust you have towards white people in the immersion schema. You experience an even greater need to connect with members of your own race and other people of color so you can feel comforted and validated when you do experience racism. You avoid white majority spaces when you can and seek community with other people of color. You may seek connection, solace, comfort, and understanding, and it goes on from there. And basically what I kind of realized is that, like, I've never really experienced immersion as somebody who lives in a predominantly white environment, has grown up in predominantly white environments. It's not like I was raised in the Black community. I am somewhat isolated from the Black community, which I think, you know, was something that my parents, like, they intentionally moved somewhere white when I was a child so that I could grow up sort of assimilated into, like, white cultural norms. For example, I speak standard American English really well because that's what I grew up around. And as a result of that, I've kind of lost my ability. I still have it somewhat, but I've kind of lost the ability to speak, like AAVE or Black American English. And there are definitely costs associated with that. But it's interesting because I also feel like I never really experienced immersion, but I have sort of skipped over to internalization. You have positive experience with white people who are anti-racist and are working to challenge racism in positive ways. You also explore other parts of who you are, like social class, gender, sexual orientation, and how these complex intersections of identity shape your experiences of race. People of color acknowledge they are more than their race. Feelings include surprise, relief, complexity, curiosity. So obviously, I know that not all white people are racist. I have tons of friends who are white. And, like, also living as being both Black and white, like, I'm mixed. I feel like I understand that both communities place, like, very limiting ideas and ideals about what you can and can't do and what you can and can't be. So yeah, I just thought it was really, really interesting to learn this theory, because we all move throughout these stages throughout our life, supposedly, and sometimes we, like, move backwards, sometimes we regress to an earlier stage, and it's also kind of coming to this realization that, like, in a similar way to depression, like, racism is not going to stop. Like, I am going to continue to experience this at different degrees throughout my life, and that's a really depressing thought if you think about it, you know, too long. Like, being a visible person, a visible face on the internet, like, I'm going to be receiving a lot more microaggressions and racial comments, especially if I choose to speak my mind on racial issues. And it's just me kind of, like, having to realize that, come to terms with it, understand that I can't educate every single white person that comes into my space, and kind of realizing that the racial comments are probably going to become more frequent. And it's also realizing there is no escape from racism, which, you know, can lead to some mental health crises because you realize this is something that you're going to keep experiencing. Kind of like with depression, like, once you realize it's going to be an on and off thing, you're never going to totally escape it or heal from it or get better. That can be really just, like, hopelessness inducing. And I feel it's sort of a similar thing, realizing that you're always going to cycle, you know, up or down, and you're going to be at different points, like, throughout your life. This book also kind of made me aware that growing up, race was not really something that was talked about in my household, which I know might be sort of weird when you realize that I came from a biracial household. But it was something that was always there even before I understood it. Like, race has always been a force that's been shaping my life, but I didn't understand, especially when I was younger, that that's what was shaping it. Like, it's always been a force, it's always been a presence, it's just my understanding of it has changed and grown and developed, and especially when I was a kid and innocent about race, I didn't really understand it. So just kind of realizing that it's always been presence and my awareness is the only thing that's changed, was also really interesting to learn. So overall, I would say, although I did learn a couple things that I previously didn't know or hadn't explored from this workbook, I wouldn't really recommend it. If I was going to do yay, nay, or meh, I would definitely say nay on this one. Just because I feel like it's so basic. It's really written for a beginner who has no background in race or race studies, and I don't think for a Black or mixed or a person of color that you're going to be somebody who's coming at this from a place of total ignorance when it comes to race. I just think most of us will probably know this stuff already, especially if you have any interest in racial topics. And I also think this book has the potential to make you feel even worse because, like I said, it is catering so heavily to white people and the white gaze and interrogating their feelings rather than focusing on the people who are most hurt by racism. I also think this book might have been more successful if it had been written by a Black author. The author, from my understanding, is biracial or mixed race, and she is part South Asian, if I'm not mistaken. I do feel like biracial or mixed people have a unique perspective where, like, they understand more than one side, more than one culture, whatever. A lot of this focused on the racial dynamics between Blacks and whites, and I think when you were specifically speaking to that, you need to have an author who's Black, especially when you're talking about something like healing. And Black Americans have a very specific experience where, like, we experience things that a lot of other racial groups, even though they do experience racism, they don't experience that. Like, they did not experience, you know, enslavement, for example. I'm going to continue looking for a resource that can hopefully help me in some way when it comes to working on my racial healing and racial growth, and I just don't think this is it. Like, I'm not particularly drawn to workbooks to begin with, just because I feel like usually it's enough for me to just think over the prompt. Like, maybe that's arrogant of me that I don't usually, like, sit down and write things out, but I just think, you know, this is either stuff I've already thought about, or, you know, the prompts are repetitive and I don't want to do them, or, you know, things like that. So I am going to continue looking. I do think this would be a good book for a white person who is a total beginner to race studies, and that's really the only way I would recommend it. I would love to know, if you're watching this and you are a person of color, I would love to know what resources you have found to further your racial healing, because obviously I really need some better suggestions. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys in my next video. Peace.